Hello and welcome to our second lecture. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 2 in our Hauser textbook. It is a chapter entitled The Research Process and Ways of Knowing. Our learning objectives for this lecture will include discussing the philosophical orientations and the influence of these choices that they have on research design. We're going to contrast the characteristics of quantitative versus qualitative research. We're going to review the steps involved in the research process, determine the way that design is linked to the research question, and classify research based on characteristics related to intent, type, and time. Mind you, in today's lecture, we are going to introduce these topics and talk about them briefly, define a lot of the words and the characteristics of said research designs, but we will not be going into a lot of detail. We will reserve that until we get to later chapters and discuss things in much more detail. Research is about a search for the truth, but there's going to be multiple approaches for determining and describing what that truth is. Research is a lot like the nursing process, where we assess, we diagnose, we plan, we implement, and we evaluate. Just like the nursing process is fluid, meaning we might move back and forth between the steps, research is a work in progress until it is all completed. So if we take the example of assessment within the nursing process, where we're using the tools that we know, our stethoscopes, our hands, and our eyes, and we're gathering information and we're trying to figure our patient out, that's just like the research process, which we're looking to define a problem. We're looking at things within our community, within our practice, and we're finding the problems or our concerns. We're looking through the literature, much like we're assessing our patient, to figure out exactly what our research process can be. And as you move down the steps of the nursing process, you can see that they really go hand in hand with what the research process is. And like I said before, research is a work in progress until it is completed. Just like the nursing process has a distinct beginning and end, but you move back and forth within the process. So regardless of the philosophical assumptions made about a research study, some characteristics are universal to each research study. Research by its very nature is systematic and rigorous. It is about a disciplined search for the truth. So here you see the steps in the foundation of a research study, starting with defining the research problems. So we're essentially going to identify the gap in the knowledge of nursing practice that can be effectively addressed with evidence. Is it something that we can study and we can gather data on? We're going to again look at the literature, completing a review to make sure that we know what the basic knowledge is on the problem, and to identify if there's any relevant information that has already been studied. We're going to determine an appropriate design, meaning we're going to select a design that's appropriate for the study, for the nature of the question, making sure that the intent of the researcher is being upheld. And then we're also going to look at our time dimensions. We're going to define our sampling strategy, meaning that we're going to detail both how the subjects will be recruited and assigned and how many subjects we need to make a valid study. We're going to collect our data, collecting our data using the appropriate collection protocols to make sure it's reliable and valid. We are going to analyze our data using the analytic techniques that we had already determined when we figured out what our techniques are, and making sure that we're answering our question. Next, we're going to communicate the findings of our data, meaning we're going to disseminate that to the appropriate audiences using conferences and publications. And the very top of our picture is using the findings. So we're going to actually promote the uptake of our research, linking it to specific guidelines within nursing practice, such as evidence-based practice and best practice for policies and procedures within the hospitals. And remember that this is a fluid process. Even though these look like stepping stones where we climb from one step to the next, it is fluid, meaning that we may go back and forth between things. Instead of it looking like a game where we just climb the ladder, think about it as chutes and ladders, where every once in a while we land on the wrong spot and we have to slide back down, and in a research study reevaluate what our goals are, or how we're asking questions, or how we're gathering our data. The philosophical assumptions that drive the design of a study are rooted in paradigms of those who are doing the studying. A paradigm is an overall belief system, a view of the world that strives to make sense of the nature of reality and the basis of knowledge. The disciplined study of nursing phenomena is rooted in two very broad paradigms, both which are relevant to nursing research. These two broad paradigms reflect methods that are primarily quantitative, which are based on the measurement of observable phenomena, or qualitative, which are based on the analysis of the meaning of events as depicted in words and actions of others. Quantitative research is a traditional approach to research in which variables are identified and measured in a reliable and valid way, whereas qualitative research is a more naturalistic approach to research in which the focus is an understanding of the meaning of an experience from the individual's perspective. Historically, data was collected and completed in a quantitative manner, meaning numbers were needed to show the validity of a study. Now there's a focus on where numbers, while they're still important and necessary, but studies need to be completed on how the quantitative data affects individuals and the group, thus qualitative studies. The idea that not everything can be controlled. For example, the view of reality in a quantitative study is objective and measurable, meaning everything can be counted and numbered and it remains the same. Versus in a qualitative study, the view of reality is constructed by individuals. It's changed. It changes based on each individual's experience. Further looking at the contrast between quantitative and qualitative studies, we can look at the generalization of the results. In the quantitative study, the results or the generalization can only be assigned to defined populations, whereas in a qualitative study, you can transfer the knowledge that you have and determine that your results may be used on different populations. Paramount to remember is that both approaches are necessary in nursing, and both types have common characteristics. They are both disciplined, rigorous approaches based on external evidence. Both methods require samples and the cooperation of individuals. There's a focus on the rights of human subject and ethical guidelines, and both have the ultimate aim at discovering new knowledge that can be used to improve nursing practice. Evaluation research is the application of research methods to the study of programs, projects, or phenomena. Mixed methods is the tool used in nursing research for evaluation research. A mixed method is a research approach that combines both quantitative and qualitative elements. It involves the description of the measurable state of the phenomena and the individual's subjective response to it. An example of a mixed method study might be to describe the rate of hand washing on a nursing unit, which is the quantitative data or the numbers of people washing their hands, as well as the nurse's perceptions about the importance of hand washing, which is the qualitative idea that each individual may have a different perception of why it's important. Many considerations go into the design selection of a study. Prior to determining the research design, the researcher needs to consider the philosophical orientation. They need to look at the nature of the research problem or question, meaning what would answer it best. You need to look at the skills and abilities and preferences of the researcher, and the resources and sample access. We need to make the method fit the study. So there are specific skills that are needed for each type of research study. In the quantitative research study, the skills that we need are the ability to define the variables. We need to be able to recruit the appropriate subjects. We need to have assignment methods, and we have to know them specifically and exactly how they're going to be used. We need to be able to create reliable and valid measurements, and we need to be able to analyze the results with statistical techniques. In contrast, the skills that are required for qualitative research are more about finding and selecting subjects that are appropriate for the research question. We need to have the ability to observe and record actions and interactions in great detail. We need to have the skill of interviewing to interview our subjects skillfully, and we need to be able to glean meaning from large amounts of word-based data. Research is classified by the basic belief system that drives its design features, but it must also reflect the intent of the researcher. There are two kinds of goals of research. The first is to provide knowledge for the foundation of nursing or basic research, or to provide knowledge that can be immediately applied to the practice of nursing, or applied research. More detailed definitions are: basic research is theoretical, pure, fundamental, or bench research done to advance the knowledge in a given subject area, while applied research is research conducted to gain knowledge that has a practical application and contributes in some way to a modification of practice. So, basic adds new knowledge, while applied is for improvement of practice, and it adds new knowledge that can be immediately applied to your practice. Another classification of research is associated with the nature of the design. Experimental research refers to studies of cause and effect, usually applied to determine the effectiveness of a certain intervention. In an experimental design, some type of randomization method is employed to select subjects or to assign them to groups according to how well they represent the population of interest. The researcher will then manipulate some aspect of the patient's treatment in a very highly controlled setting and compares the outcome of the group that has received no treatment or standard treatment to the experimental treatment. If the outcomes are different, the researcher assumes that the difference is the result of the treatment because all other variables have been controlled. This design is aimed at eliminating bias and controlling rival explanations for its outcome. So experimental research is highly structured studies of cause and effect. It's usually applied to determine the effectiveness of an intervention. Subjects are selected and randomly assigned to groups that represent the population of interest. Whereas quasi-experimental studies mimic experimental designs in most ways except for the selection and assignment of subjects. Such studies often use convenient sampling or existing groups to test interventions. So a quasi-experimental studies the cause and effects similar to experimental design, but using convenient sampling or existing groups to test interventions. For example, a quasi-experimental study might test an intervention by selecting populations in two different nursing homes, where one group gets the standard treatment and the other does not. A final classification of research studies is by the time dimension chosen for the studies. A retrospective study is a study that is conducted using data that has already been collected about events that have already happened. Such secondary data was originally collected for a purpose other than the current study, which is different than a prospective study, which is a study planned by the researcher for the collection of primary data for the specific study and implemented in the future. Studies can also be characterized based on whether they are conducted over time or at a single point in time. Longitudinal studies are studies conducted by following subjects over a period of time with data collection occurring at prescribed intervals, whereas cross-sectional study are studies conducted by looking at a single phenomenon across multiple populations at a single point in time with no intention for follow-up in the design. Choosing the appropriate theoretical and conceptual framework for a research study is the necessary backbone of a valid study. It lends credibility to our study and making sure that we have used the right framework allows for comparisons across studies as well as building from or between studies. So our goal for this class is that you use research, that you become an excellent consumer of research. In order to be a consumer of research, you have to have a basic understanding of some of the principles that I began to describe today. We're going to go into many of the principles in much more detail further in the class, but in order to start looking at research holistically, you have to just have simple definitions and a basic understanding of the framework of research. So our goal is that you start consuming research, that you can look at things with a critical eye. You can look at it and say, is this an appropriate study methodology? Did they have an appropriate sample? Can I transfer this study to my patient population? Is the science good? All of these questions that you need to be able to look at a research study, look at an article, and answer those questions to determine whether or not you should focus the results of this research and bring them into your practice. I hope that you all have an excellent day, and we will see you on Friday. And remember to continue to check D2L for any updates on the course. Thanks, and have an excellent, excellent day.